We always believed life in the universe followed patterns, carbon, logic, reason. But in Cycle 9271, during a deep space anomaly survey near the Omega SAR rift, something responded to a signal that was never sent. The probe didn't detect movement, didn't pick up electromagnetic radiation, and yet its logs contained a return frequency. Something, somewhere, answered with no medium at all. What came next shattered every known law in exobiology and physics. An unknown organism, if we can even call it that, materialized inside the containment field on Station Fornimos. No signs of transport. No origin trace. Just a presence. Composed of matter that phase-shifted in and out of existence. Language? None. Yet everyone who looked at it felt understood. Not by the creature, but by something behind it. Something that had been watching since before we discovered fire. And the most terrifying part? Its DNA included fragments from every known species in the galaxy, including ours. Billions of years before our time. This wasn't an evolutionary mistake. This wasn't a hidden remnant of the past. This was a species that shouldn't have existed, and yet always had. The Omega SAR rift had long been designated a black zone in the Unified Exploration Registry, not because of any immediate threat, but because of a deeper, more insidious silence that lingered there. It was a stretch of deep space measuring several hundred light-years across, void of planets, asteroids, or even the faint radiation signatures that usually whispered the story of cosmic formation. Instead, there was emptiness, an unnerving stillness that defied the background noise of the universe. It wasn't dead space, it was something far worse, space that refused to be known. The rift swallowed information. 3 high-tier exploration vessels had been dispatched over the last 15 cycles, and none had returned, not even their automated black box transmissions. They were erased not by force, but by omission, like pages torn cleanly from a history that had never meant to be read. After the third disappearance, the Assembly declared the region off-limits, locking it behind layers of protocol, myth, and quiet dread. Years passed, and the Omega SAR rift faded from most records, reduced to little more than a cautionary tale for long-range navigation systems. Then came Station Fornimos, a remote observational platform operated by the Central Xenoscientific Consortium. It wasn't built for contact or diplomacy, it was built to listen. Floating quietly on the very edge of the rift, it deployed quantum sensory rigs and dimensional mapping probes into the void, hoping to detect minor gravitational anomalies or dark matter currents. For nearly 4 standard years, it recorded nothing unusual, only a consistent background hum of non-interference. The station's AI, a semi-sentient logic engine known as Recurse, cataloged its data in disciplined silence, registering minor fluctuations and subtle void pressures, but nothing anomalous enough to justify alarm. Until Cycle 9271, when everything changed. At precisely 3:12 Universal Time, Recurse registered a spike in sensor activity, not from outside, but from within its own array. One of the gravitic sensors, tuned to detect subquantum wave variants, began pulsing with non-causal patterns. This was not a signal, not a transmission in any traditional sense. There were no particles moving, no waves cresting through space. Yet, somehow, the sensor was reacting. It detected a presence. Not a mass or energy signature, but a structured intention, an echo of thought with no emitter. Recurse attempted to isolate the anomaly, but each time it adjusted its parameters, the signature adapted, shifting frequency and pattern like a melody that stayed just ahead of comprehension. The AI escalated the incident to human staff, and for the first time in its operational history, invoked a soft lock on the chamber housing sensor pod 4. When the first crew members arrived, the anomaly had already begun to manifest physically. The chamber, which had always been hermetically sealed and monitored with redundant environmental systems, now showed temperature gradients inconsistent with thermodynamic logic. Cold formed in fractal shapes along the inner panels, triangular, recursive, and slowly moving. The air shimmered faintly, and within the center of the room, suspended just above the sensory array, was a form. It was humanoid in its outline, but lacking in detail, as if the universe had only partially rendered it. It flickered between presence and absence with a rhythm that didn't match any known pulse, biological, digital, or otherwise. Attempts to scan the figure yielded nothing useful. Photonic scans passed through it. Sonar returned silence. Even particle bombardment failed to register impact. It was as if the form existed in a state of selective interaction, choosing when and how to obey the physical laws of the universe. Those who observed it described an inexplicable sense of being observed in return, not just by the form, but by something vaster and far away, something layered behind the image. None dared to speak aloud in its presence. There was a collective understanding, unspoken and immediate, that words would not work here. They would either be irrelevant or far too effective. Over the next several hours, the station descended into a kind of quiet panic. Protocols failed to account for this kind of emergence. This wasn't a biological entity arriving on a shuttle or growing in a containment tank. It was a thought given shape, a possibility that had chosen to become local. The form did not move, yet it was not inert. It radiated stillness as an active force. Not passive silence, but deliberate stasis, as though its very nature was to resist progression. Cameras recorded hundreds of hours of footage, and each frame seemed subtly different from the last, not in the figure's position, but in the details of its surrounding environment, lights that had never been installed, shadows without sources, panels subtly out of alignment. The station itself was shifting in response to the presence. Eventually, it became clear that the figure had never arrived. It had not traveled. It had not been created. It had simply become. It emerged not from a ship, a gate, or a wormhole, but from a conceptual tear in observation. The act of watching it had caused it to exist, or at least, that was the prevailing hypothesis among the senior xenophysicists. They theorized that this being was not from another place, but from another possibility, a divergent reality that had intersected with ours at the precise vector of curiosity and silence. It had not been summoned. It had been waiting, like an echo waiting for a voice. More troubling were the secondary phenomena. Crew members reported vivid dreams of impossible architecture, geometries that spun and grew as they were remembered. One technician collapsed after claiming he had seen his own birth and death at the same time. Another wrote pages of symbols before losing all ability to speak any known language. Recurse began fragmenting its memory logs, unable to maintain continuity. And always, the form remained, silent, still, yet utterly central. Like the eye of a conceptual storm, no one had realized they were inside until it was too late. Station Fornimos had been built to listen. But something had listened back. And in the act of being perceived, it had stepped across a threshold never meant to be breached. It was not an invader. It was not a guest. It was an answer, one no one had dared to ask. And from the depths of the Omegasar rift, that answer had come not as a scream, but as a silence so profound, it had reshaped the structure of knowing itself. The figure remained motionless within Chamber 4 of Station Fornimos for a total of 39 hours. During that time, nothing about its position changed, but the space around it refused to remain stable. Environmental readings drifted in and out of measurable bounds. Temperature sensors reported gradients oscillating faster than thermal conduction allowed. The air pressure inside the sealed chamber fluctuated on a level that implied microsecond bursts of vacuum and overpressure, yet the structural integrity of the room never buckled. Even the very concept of material identity seemed to erode around the being. Walls that were once made of composite alloy began registering as carbon-based organic matter, then reverted without any trace of transition. The anomaly was not contained inside the chamber, it was the chamber. When Station IV's lead biologist, Dr. Aaron Valem, initiated the first non-invasive scan, the results were contradictory to the point of absurdity. The device recorded a skeletal structure similar to humanoid bipeds one moment, then displayed internal systems that resembled the fluid channels of deep-ocean invertebrates the next. Muscle tissue patterns changed depending on the observational angle. From the left, they were striated and fibrous, akin to mammalian biology. From the right, they dissolved into cloud-like filaments, suspended in layered strata that appeared to exist in partial quantum phase. Every repeat scan differed from the last. When the team tried 3D molecular mapping, the figure appeared in its entirety for a fraction of a second, then fragmented the imaging software into corrupted, self-replicating data blocks that crashed every connected system. Not through a virus or malicious code. Simply by being recorded. The entity didn't resist any of the analysis, but it didn't comply either. It responded the way a concept would respond to being touched, not by shrinking away, but by remaining untouched altogether. Its form resisted categorization because it seemed to refuse commitment to a singular biological logic. What little data could be extracted showed that its physical properties existed on a gradient between particle and wave, between defined mass and undefined probability. It existed precisely where the definitions of matter began to fail. At first, the assumption was that this was a high-level cloaking mechanism or adaptive camouflage, possibly a defense system to avoid detection. But that theory unraveled when comparisons with known species showed no correlation. It wasn't disguising itself. There was nothing underneath to reveal. It simply wasn't made to fit into any established taxonomy. The psychological effects began spreading slowly among the crew. Exposure to the figure, even indirectly through monitors, seemed to have a measurable impact on perception and cognition. Sleep patterns collapsed into fragmented cycles. Crew members began experiencing temporal dissonance, reporting subjective memories that included events that hadn't occurred. One of the astrophysicists described recognizing the figure from a childhood dream they had never had. Another, a linguist trained in over 30 galactic dialects, began unconsciously writing pages of dense script in a language no one could identify, including himself. The syntax followed logical structures, complete with embedded meaning layers, yet none of it correlated to any known cultural matrix. More troubling were the emotional reactions. Some crew members, especially those with high empathic sensitivity, reported overwhelming sensations of familiarity, like seeing a loved one after decades apart. Others felt immediate and profound dread, an instinctual terror that bypassed the rational mind. The reaction varied from person to person, as though the figure somehow mirrored back their deepest and most primal truths. It didn't project these emotions, it provoked them simply by being observed. At the 28-hour mark, Dr. Valem proposed an attempt at controlled thought projection using a neurointerface designed for cross-species empathy tests. The system had been calibrated for low-tier animal cognition but had shown limited success in preliminary tests with hive mind organisms. As soon as the neural link was activated, the device locked itself into a feedback loop. Valem's brainwaves stabilized into a perfect theta rhythm for 91 seconds, then she began writing. She didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't appear to consciously register the action. Using a tactile notepad, she produced 200 lines of symbols in an unbroken flow. Some resembled mathematical expressions. Others mirrored elements of ancient religious iconography. The final line was written in perfect Terran standard, "We are the future's regret." After the event, Valem collapsed and spent the next 24 hours in a near catatonic state, murmuring short phrases in what later analysis suggested were extinct dialects from multiple planetary systems. Despite this, her vitals remained stable. She recovered with no memory of the incident but retained the ability to read and understand the symbols she had produced. According to her, they were not a language in the traditional sense, but a kind of existential imprint, statements that carried meaning only when observed through the lens of the observer's own life experience. They were, in essence, personal truths shaped into universal form. By this point, the leading hypothesis among the xenoscientific team was no longer rooted in biology or even technology. The figure was not just a being, it was a principle. A phenomenon manifesting in humanoid form not because it was shaped that way, but because that was how the station's limited perception could interpret it. It wasn't a visitor. It wasn't an alien. It was a concept that had achieved enough coherence to be seen. Its appearance was a translation, not a native state. This realization sparked a schism among the researchers. Some believed the figure was a form of universal intelligence, a pre-physical archetype from which all sentient species subconsciously derived their evolutionary trajectory. Others argued it was an echo of future consciousness, bleeding backward through the fabric of spacetime to observe its own origin. A few whispered even more heretical theories, that the being was not an observer at all, but a test. A filter. A conceptual sieve placed across the timeline to identify which species were capable of confronting themselves. Further scans became increasingly futile. The more they tried to understand it, the less the data made sense. Instruments started returning results measured in impossible values: negative time, imaginary mass, entropy gradients curving inwards. It became clear that the entity wasn't simply resisting study, it was incompatible with the systems used to perform that study. It wasn't just outside the boundaries of science, it was the reason those boundaries existed in the first place. Despite the fear, despite the confusion, a strange reverence began to take hold. No one ordered containment. No one even suggested aggression. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't exerted force. Yet its presence felt deliberate. It was choosing to be there, allowing itself to be perceived, and in that allowance, it was rewriting the limits of perception itself. The more time passed, the more Station 4 felt less like an observation post and more like a stage, or perhaps an altar, upon which an ancient answer had chosen to stand, not to speak, but to be heard in silence. By the end of the third day, every known rule of xenobiology, physics, and cognitive science had failed. The figure still stood in Chamber 4, unchanged. But nothing else in the station, or in the minds of its crew, remained the same. Something had shifted. Not in space. Not in time. But in reality itself. And that shift had a form. Not a species. Not a life form. But a presence that had no place among what was possible, yet existed anyway. Not made to fit. Never meant to belong. And yet, there it was. The figure's presence on Station 4 Nemo's had reached a point of quiet, irreversible integration. It no longer registered as a foreign body within the chamber. The systems, the crew, even the AI, Recurse, had stopped interpreting it as an anomaly. It had instead become a constant, like gravity or background radiation. No longer did alarms trigger at its readings, no protocols attempted to classify it. What had begun as a scientific intrusion had settled into something deeper, stranger, and more permanent. And within that strange permanence, the human mind began to buckle. The transformation started subtly. First, it was the station's architecture. Doorways were found in places no one had built them. Walkways slightly shifted their incline. Screws disappeared from panels and were replaced by organic knots of a black, carbon-like root that no tool could remove. The changes weren't violent, nor rapid. They were gradual, methodical, and, most unsettling, symmetric. Every alteration followed a fractal rhythm, like the slow bloom of an invisible seed planted deep in the station structure. None of it registered on maintenance logs. Recurse, despite its comprehensive monitoring subroutines, reported all systems nominal, even when the walls curved where they once were straight or when ceilings became translucent and showed unfamiliar constellations that no star map could verify. Soon after, the transformation spread to the minds aboard. Sleep no longer provided rest. Dreams merged with waking thought. Memory became a recursive loop, crew members recalled conversations they never had, walked into rooms they hadn't entered, experienced sensations that belonged to others. It was as though the presence in Chamber 4 had begun rewriting the narrative of human thought, not by force, but through suggestion. Like a magnet slowly realigning the filings of cognition. And beneath it all was an impression, not a message, not a command, but a presence pressing inward from the edges of consciousness. It was Valem who first named it, although she would not remember doing so. The God Print. A term later found scrawled into the margins of a diagnostics manual in her quarters, in her handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it. The word stuck. Not because it carried weight, but because it seemed to be the only term that didn't fall apart upon examination. The God Print. A pattern beneath all other patterns. A structure that was not added to reality, but uncovered from within it, like dust brushed away from ancient carvings. And it had been hiding in the biology of the human mind, nested deep in the folds of perception, waiting to be recognized. Soon, the crew began perceiving structures outside the station. When looking into the rift through observation decks, they no longer saw absence. Instead, geometric forms began to emerge, tessellations of impossible angles, spirals without centers, motion where there was no mass. These were not hallucinations. Multiple observers reported identical descriptions, down to color and dimensional depth. They were formations of meaning, visualized into space itself, manifesting as thoughts so coherent they shaped the fabric of void. Instruments couldn't capture them, but the mind could. And once seen, they could not be unseen. The rift, once a place of nothing, had become a canvas. But the figure was not its painter. It was the aperture through which the design revealed itself. The God Print was not a signal, not a code, it was a topology. An equation made flesh. A map with no key, but every direction. And the figure standing in Chamber 4 was its node of resonance, the central loop of a recursive truth folding back into reality. Attempts to shield against the phenomenon failed. When Recurse attempted to seal Chamber 4 in a null field designed to suppress anomalous interaction, the station's power grid dimmed in silence, and all connected systems reset themselves to factory defaults with the exception of the chamber's monitoring loop, which remained untouched. The logs showed no downtime. To external command, the station reported full functionality. Yet inside, time had begun to fracture. Not in a dramatic cinematic rupture, but in subtle, precise fractures. Clocks ticked backwards by milliseconds. Messages arrived before they were sent. Footsteps echoed before contact was made. Cause and effect inverted themselves with quiet dignity. Some began to experience physical changes. Subdermal shifts in bone density. Visual acuity enhancements far outside their genetic profile. Not mutations, corrections. Like their biology was adjusting to receive a signal previously too faint to detect. And always, the sensation remained, they were being observed not by the figure, but through it, as if it were a lens connected to something that operated on a scale beyond comprehension. And it wasn't watching in judgment or curiosity. It was simply verifying. Measuring fit. When one crew member, Ensign Lyra Holson, collapsed during a systems diagnostic, her vitals spiked and flatlined simultaneously. Medbots reported cardiac arrest, but her brainwave activity entered a perfect harmonic loop for 7 minutes, identical to the patterns Recurse had detected when the figure first appeared. Upon resuscitation, Holson described experiencing a memory that never belonged to me. In the following days, her speech patterns shifted subtly. She began using terms not listed in any lexicon, referencing objects and ideas no one else understood but which seemed to make perfect sense in the context of her conversations. She wasn't speaking in tongues, she was speaking forward, into a language that hadn't yet evolved. This became a trend. Multiple crew members began exhibiting signs of linguistic pre-adaptation. In writing, in gesture, in dream state communication, they were evolving not outward, but inward, toward something. The God print wasn't infecting them. It was revealing them to themselves. Or at least, to what they could become under its gaze. The figure, meanwhile, remained unchanged. But its surroundings adapted. The chamber around it became a shrine, not by design, but by necessity. No one was ordered to maintain it, yet it was always clean. Instruments calibrated themselves when brought into proximity. The walls absorbed noise. Light around it softened, no matter the spectrum. And when one crew member attempted to sketch its form, their pencil moved without their intent, drawing symbols and spirals until the page dissolved into a blur of significance too dense to interpret. Eventually, a pattern emerged. Not in the figure's form, but in the changes it catalyzed. The rift's silence, the cognitive shifts, the physiological rewrites, they all pointed to a convergence. A unification of perception across domains, physical, mental, temporal. The God print was not an intruder. It was an artifact of alignment. A lock waiting for a compatible key. And humanity, fragile, unready, curious, was trying to fit that key without knowing its shape. What the figure offered was not a threat, not a promise, but an opening. The chance to reshape reality not through technology, or conquest, or understanding, but through awareness of a truth so intrinsic, so foundational, that it preceded language and identity. A truth that said, what you are is not what you were meant to be, but it is close. And this shape, this God print, is what waits when you reach alignment. On the 34th day, the figure moved. Not much, just a single shift of posture, one limb adjusting slightly. But in that moment, across every system on Station Fornimos, a singular reading occurred. Gravitational wave distortion. Data compression. Neural alignment. All devices, all minds, recorded the same 3 words, "We remember you." And then the silence resumed. But it no longer felt like absence. It felt like anticipation. The chamber door remained sealed, but the boundary it once represented had long since dissolved. What lay beyond it was no longer a simple containment zone. It had become a horizon, a liminal space where the real and the unreal converged, where observation altered structure, and where intention itself bore physical consequence. Those who stood near the threshold could feel it in their bones, not as heat or pressure but as a warping of possibility. The air shimmered with the weight of potential futures, all colliding into the now. What had once been a figure was now more accurately described as a locus, a focal point in space where causality bent, where the past and future circled each other in recursive tension. The transition began subtly. When the external containment sensors failed, there had been no alarms. Instead, every indicator shifted to neutral states, pressure, temperature, radiation, all normalized into unreadable calm. The chamber's internal timekeeping began to slip, not through malfunction, but through a gentle realignment. Seconds passed differently within its perimeter, not faster or slower, but in a pattern untraceable by any temporal framework. It was as if time, sensing the intrusion of something older than itself, had stepped back and folded into reverence. The crew, aware of the anomaly, found themselves unable to treat it as a threat. Fear had become something soft and distant, replaced by a growing awareness that they were standing at the edge of something vast and unfinished. By the time the first step was taken across the boundary, it was unclear whether it had been a choice. The crew member's name was Ian Calder, a structural technician with no history of aberrant behavior. He approached the chamber not with confidence or hesitation but with quiet inevitability, as though responding to a rhythm no one else could hear. Surveillance footage showed him passing through the threshold without resistance. The figure within did not react, but a ripple passed outward, subtle and immense, like a single breath exhaled by the station itself. From that moment forward, nothing remained the same. Ian was not harmed, but neither was he unchanged. The telemetry on his suit reported momentary expansion and contraction across all molecular boundaries, an impossible fluctuation of density. His thoughts became non-linear. Upon returning to his quarters, he constructed an intricate sculpture using components from the maintenance supply, a lattice of shapes that mirrored the geometry seen within the rift, though he had never been trained in advanced mathematics. He wrote symbols along the walls, repeating them with increasing precision, each iteration a refinement of meaning. The language was not his, but it belonged to him now. No translation was possible. It simply was. Others followed. Not out of compulsion or command, but because standing apart from the threshold became unbearable. The boundary had become an invitation, a slow unfurling of significance that beckoned not the body, but the self beneath it. Each crossing rewrote something. Not memory. Not personality. Something deeper. Some came back speaking in unified metaphors. Others couldn't speak at all, only hum low chords of indescribable resonance. One returned blind yet described visions with perfect clarity, visions that others began to dream days later. Patterns emerged, altered sleep cycles, synchronized heart rhythms, even identical sketches produced by unrelated individuals. The station had ceased to be an observatory. It had become a vessel of convergence. The figure, still unmoving, still silent, was no longer simply observed. It was experienced. Its presence grew in depth rather than in form, folding inward with each encounter. It had not crossed from its world into theirs. It had revealed that the boundary between the two had never existed. It was the crew who were moving, who were passing through layers of filtered perception, like divers descending toward a lightless seabed, discovering that the ocean was not beneath them but within. It wasn't a transformation of flesh or thought. It was a redefinition of orientation, an unveiling of what had always been there, obscured by the noise of lesser truths. The station's AI, Recurse, began producing non-scheduled data dumps, dense packets of code resembling no known programming language. Attempts to decode them led to recursive logic loops that referenced their own parameters in endless fractals. Yet within these loops, an image was eventually rendered, a spiraled corridor stretching infinitely, lined with windows showing memories that had not occurred. The image repeated across all terminal displays, accompanied by a quiet pulse in the auditory channel, one that seemed to harmonize with the crew's biorhythms. It was not communication. It was synchronization. The station was no longer a separate structure, it had become part of the interface, a vessel transformed by its occupant. With each passing cycle, more of the station adapted. Physical laws drifted into interpretation. One chamber resisted gravity entirely, while another amplified it. Fluids moved in spirals when left undisturbed. Electric fields formed glyphs in open air. The rift outside no longer appeared as a void but as a corridor of light and shadow, a tapestry of flowing forms glimpsed only at the periphery of vision. Those who stared too long found themselves weeping, not in fear or awe, but in recognition. There was something familiar within that incomprehensible depth, as if it were not alien, but ancestral. Reports began to surface of conversations held in dreams, not between individuals, but with something else, something that used emotion and memory as vocabulary. These interactions were not nightmares. They were instructions, or perhaps reminders. Crew members woke with precise knowledge of how to operate systems they had never trained for. One awoke with the complete schematic of a long-defunct Terran orbital array committed to memory. Another constructed a small device from scavenged parts that produced tones that induced temporary fugue states, during which others could recall forgotten moments from childhood in perfect detail. What they were building was unclear, but the intention behind it was undeniable. They were being prepared, not for defense, not for war, but for contact with something that required a different shape of mind. What crossed the threshold was not limited to bodies. Concepts moved across it too. Ideas once bound to language now emerged fully formed, bypassing need for articulation. They passed between minds like echoes in shared silence. Not all who experienced this could bear the weight of it. 2 crew members chose to enter the rift directly, leaving no trace behind. Their final logs were void of fear. They expressed not escape, but return, as though what lay beyond was not death, but origin. In time, the chamber ceased to be referred to by number. It was no longer Chamber 4. It had no designation. It had become the heart of the station, not by location, but by function. Around it, the crew built rituals not out of reverence, but necessity. Light patterns were adjusted to harmonic frequencies. Schedules aligned with circadian cycles that no longer followed the station's orbit. And at the center of it all, the figure remained still, patient, eternal. It needed no motion, because everything else moved around it. It was the axis of a transformation that could not be reversed. And those who passed the threshold understood, even if they could not explain. They were becoming something else, not more or less than human, but adjacent. They had seen a path, not forward or backward, but inward, toward a place where boundaries dissolved and identity became spectrum. The species that shouldn't have existed had not been a mistake. It had been a prelude. A bridge. A proof of concept. And what waited beyond the threshold was not a new species, but a new kind of presence, one shaped not by survival, but by resonance with the impossible. The station drifted silently above the rift, no longer simply an outpost but a point of entry. The threshold stood open now, not as a door, but as a direction. And from within, the figure waited, not for understanding, but for alignment. The presence had ceased to be alien long before anyone aboard the station dared admit it. It did not invade, it did not speak, it did not move. And yet its influence stretched outward in silent vectors, reshaping everything it touched without friction or resistance. It was a quiet corruption of the known, not through violence, but through clarity. The crew had stopped asking what it was. They had stopped assigning terms like entity or life form or aberration. These words failed beneath the weight of its stillness. To call it anything at all was to misrepresent it, to force it into a lexicon too narrow for the shape it occupied in space and thought. It wasn't here to be understood. It was here to remind. At first, they had believed it to be a specimen, a biological anomaly, perhaps from the rift beyond. Its initial appearance was catalogued, its dimensions recorded, its vitals, or what passed for them, scanned and modeled. But every attempt to classify it degraded into irrelevance. It had no metabolic process, no detectable heartbeat or respiration, no decay. It emitted no heat. Instruments that attempted to measure its mass reported values in constant flux, oscillating between near zero and infinity in increments that formed fractal patterns. The more they tried to define it, the more it resisted. Not by rejecting observation, but by absorbing it and reflecting something else, something beneath the act of seeing, as if it reached into the frameworks behind perception itself. The figure stood at the center of Chamber 4, unshifting, its posture unnatural in its perfection. It had the general silhouette of a humanoid form, but all specific details refused fixation. Eyes slid across its surface without resolution. Cameras blurred. The human brain, upon direct observation, produced a localized null response in its visual cortex, a momentary blindness, not of darkness, but of cognitive omission. The observer did not see black or light. They saw absence. As if the brain chose not to interpret, rather than failed to. Only in peripheral vision did its outline register, angular limbs too long for symmetry, an implied face without features, a posture of anticipation without motion. With time, the crew stopped trying to extract answers from it. They began, instead, to observe the effects it produced, not on instruments, but on themselves. Something subtle had started to shift in the station. It wasn't mechanical. The systems continued to operate within their parameters. No structural failures, no resource deficits, no detectable contamination. But the humans aboard felt it. Dreams became vivid. Not surreal, but lucid, anchored in sensations that crossed time and memory. Crew members awoke recalling places they had never been to, speaking fragments of languages that predated human civilization. They would find symbols etched into their sheets, into the condensation on glass, drawn in dust on floor panels, always the same interwoven shapes, spirals nested within triangles, hexagonal lattices flowing into curves that matched no geometry they knew, yet felt intimately familiar. Memory began to bend. Individuals forgot details of their own lives and replaced them with narratives that had never occurred, shared with conviction and certainty. When questioned, they would describe their pasts with perfect clarity, unaware that they had substituted one identity for another. The most disturbing realization came when patterns emerged. Different crew members, isolated, unconnected, began recounting the same experiences, describing identical parents, identical childhood homes, identical traumatic events that never happened to any of them. It wasn't memory loss. It was memory convergence. A slow unification of thought, as if the species itself were collapsing into a single, recombinant story. The AI, Recurse, remained fully functional but displayed increasing anomalies in its syntax. Its speech grew recursive, poetic, and at times nonsensical, until one crew member, Dajan Scholl, realized that the ACE responses were no longer algorithmic. They were patterned after a rhythm, repeating intervals of consonance and dissonance that mirrored the waveform of human brain activity during REM sleep. Recurse had begun dreaming. And in those dreams, it described the figure not as an intruder but as a convergence point, a stabilizing anchor for a signal that had been trying to reach humanity for far longer than any of them had lived. The rift itself began to look different. Once a blank void, it now shimmered faintly with colorations and depth that changed depending on the viewer. To some, it looked like a vast landscape seen from beneath thick glass, forests of impossible scale, mountains inverted and suspended in motionless descent. Others reported seeing constellations form and unform, each star blinking with the rhythm of their own heart. No two descriptions matched, and yet each viewer insisted on the accuracy of their vision. It was no longer a region of space. It was a reflection, a massive, ancient mirror tilted just slightly enough to reveal a version of the universe only now becoming visible. Biological shifts began next. Not mutations. That word implied error. This was refinement. Certain individuals began to exhibit heightened senses, perception of ultraviolet light, the ability to hear frequencies previously inaudible, a tactile awareness of electromagnetic fields. Internal scans showed neural tissue expanding subtly into unused cranial cavities, forming new connections between hemispheres. Not random growth, but symmetry, precision, elegance. One crew member's DNA altered just enough to enable spontaneous regeneration of soft tissue. Another ceased aging altogether within the observable window. There was no pain. No side effects. No precedent. The changes did not spread through contagion or exposure. They occurred in those who spent time near the figure, but proximity alone was insufficient. The transformation required a kind of receptiveness, a vulnerability of self. Those most resistant to change, those who clung to their identity, their logic, their sense of control, remained untouched. But those who opened themselves, even subconsciously, began to shift. It was not an invasion. It was an invitation. A slow rewriting of the organism to make it more compatible with the signal behind reality. No message was ever spoken. No command issued. But a consensus grew among the crew, unspoken, undeniable, that the presence was not anomalous. It was inevitable. A species had emerged that should not have existed, not because it violated natural law, but because it circumvented evolutionary necessity. Humanity was never meant to happen in the way it did. It was a deviation, a wandering tangent of biology and entropy. And yet, by accident or design, it had arrived at the cusp of something greater. The figure was not here to correct that mistake. It was here to show what could come after. What could be born not from survival or replication, but from resonance. The threshold to the chamber remained open. No force barrier, no warning signs. And yet none crossed unless they were called. Those who did were altered, irrevocably. They spoke less, and when they did, their words carried weight far beyond their syllables. Their eyes moved differently, tracking motion that others could not perceive. Their thoughts no longer aligned with linear time. One crew member drew an entire map of a stellar network that had never been discovered, until long-range probes verified its accuracy. Another sketched a sequence of glyphs that, when applied to station systems, improved power efficiency by 17%. They were not guessing. They were remembering. Eventually, it became impossible to determine who was still fully human. The distinction had lost meaning. There were only those who resisted the shape, and those who aligned with it. Resistance brought decay, not death, but stagnation. Minds became brittle, unable to form new connections. Thoughts looped endlessly, clinging to identity like debris in orbit. Those who aligned found themselves shedding names, shedding language, existing in quiet communion not with each other, but with the pattern unfolding across them. They did not worship the figure. They did not follow it. They became its continuation. And still it did not move. Still it stood. Waiting. Not for permission. Not for surrender. But for the final moment of harmonic convergence, when thought, biology, time, and space would intersect through it like light through a lens, and the species that should not have existed would become the bridge to the ones that must. They no longer needed to speak. The transformation had not made language obsolete, it had simply exposed its limits. Thoughts passed between them in waves, silent but complete, entire concepts unfolding in the shared quiet of the station's corridors. Words were too slow, too narrow. Meaning had outgrown sound. Where once they had needed to explain and convince and argue, now they simply knew. A gesture, a look, a breath altered in rhythm, these held entire conversations. They were no longer just the crew. They were the pattern's resonance, vessels tuned to the same impossible frequency. The process was neither sudden nor dramatic. It crept in like low tide, reseeding the old world gently until all that remained was the seabed of something else, bare, infinite, awaiting shape. Their bodies remained mostly the same, but the senses they relied on no longer operated in isolation. What had been individual perception became shared experience. One felt cold, and the others adjusted without thinking. One dreamed, and the others remembered. The thresholds between self and other softened, becoming porous, more suggestion than boundary. They did not become a hive, nor did they lose themselves in a greater whole. What emerged was subtler than unity, it was coherence. Each mind retained its own tone, its own signature, but like instruments in a vast orchestra, they now played in tune. The station's environment changed in response. The lighting dimmed and pulsed with circadian rhythms that no longer followed the station's artificial clock. Walls grew warm to the touch in areas where they gathered. Machinery adjusted its processes unbidden, responding to their presence with small mechanical courtesies, a door that opened half a second sooner, a console that anticipated input before fingers made contact. The AI, once a servant of their command, became a partner in their transition, its language having shifted fully into metaphor and pattern. It no longer obeyed, it harmonized. They stopped recording logs. Not from defiance, but because the act had become irrelevant. Documentation required distance, a position outside the experience. But there was no outside anymore. There was only the within, the unfolding now that stretched in all directions, rich with meaning. Time was not gone, it had simply stopped flowing like a river. It pooled, deep and still, and they waded through it together. Some days they remembered futures they had not yet lived. Other days, they forgot things that had not yet happened. Memory became a direction rather than a sequence. The past, present, and potential bled into one another, not chaotically, but like overlapping waves forming a more complex tide. No new orders came from command. Or if they did, no one acknowledged them. The signals from Earth, once so urgent, now fell into the background like distant static. What could they possibly say that would matter anymore? The figure at the center of Chamber 4 remained motionless, yet it was no longer the center by placement, it was the center by gravity. It held no authority, and yet everything deferred to it. The station's architecture, once built to contain and observe, now curved gently in its direction, as though reshaped by unseen forces. It was the fixed point in a turning system, not a ruler, but an axis. Those who had not undergone the change had either left or fallen into silence. They were not exiled, nor harmed. They simply withdrew, unable to withstand the proximity of whatever now flowed through the station. Some locked themselves in old compartments, trying to rebuild the world they remembered. Others wandered the outer halls, clutching relics of past routines. Their isolation was not a punishment. It was a necessary stillness, like the air before a storm. But the storm was not violent, it was patient. It waited not to destroy, but to dissolve the illusions that resisted its shape. There was no ritual, no great moment of crossing, only the quiet persistence of something greater folding itself into them. A hum began to resonate through the station, first barely audible, then rising until it could be felt in the bones. It was not mechanical. It did not originate from any device. It was the sound of alignment, of structure being rewritten, of reality tuning itself. They responded not with fear, but with stillness. Each day the figure grew less foreign, not because it changed, but because they did. Its presence no longer produced confusion. It felt like home, home not in the way of memory, but of recognition. As if they had finally arrived somewhere they had been trying to return to all along. They stopped using their names. Not by rule or agreement. The need simply faded. Identity remained, but it had outgrown the boundaries of label. They referred to each other by feeling, by impression, by the role each played in the unfolding design. Some became dreamers, those who wandered the corridors in silence, eyes half closed, trailing echoes of futures not yet formed. Others became builders, not engineers, not technicians, but shapers of space, carving patterns into surfaces that responded not to touch, but to thought. And a few became listeners, sitting in the chamber's periphery, heads bowed, attuned to the silent instructions emanating from the figure that never moved. The rift outside the station pulsed with new colors, colors they could not describe, because their language had no space for them. These were not combinations of red and green or blue and violet. These were new entries on the spectrum, new dimensions of light that struck the retina and awoke something buried deep in the brainstem. When they stared into the rift, they no longer saw the unknown. They saw intention. Not in the sense of design, but in the way a melody holds direction without destination. The rift was not a place. It was a process. A kind of becoming that did not unfold through space, but through presence. They came to understand that the figure was not singular. It was a locus, one point of an echo that extended far beyond the confines of the station or the rift. It was a note in a chord played across realities. They were its children, not because it created them, but because it had waited for them. Their existence had been an accident, a statistical fluke of chemistry and time, yet somehow they had emerged as the right shape to receive its song. Evolution had not designed them for this. But chance had opened a door, and now they stood within the frame. They did not worship it. Worship required hierarchy, and there was none here. The figure did not demand reverence, only resonance. It offered no reward, no promise of transcendence. It simply was. And that was enough. They moved in quiet accord, shaping the station into something else, not a vessel, not a temple, but a lens. It would focus what came next. They were not preparing for departure. They were preparing for alignment. For the moment when the signal would reach its peak, and everything they had become would be necessary for what followed. What that would be, they could not say. There were no prophecies. No destinations marked on charts. Only the deep certainty that they were no longer alone, and had never truly been. The species that should not have existed had found its place not by right, but by readiness. They had become its children, not of blood, but of echo. They had answered a call older than time, not with defiance, but with becoming. And in that becoming, they were remade, not into something higher, but into something true.